Okay. Yeah, hi. It's Paul Scorpin, sitting here in the middle or the end of July, and it's just sitting here in Bavaria, and it's been raining and raining and raining, and it's quite cold. I'm here in my seminar room in Andex, and I have some time now, and I want to share with some folks who are interested. Some of you might know me, and you might know about my work, and others may not, but I'm going to put this on YouTube later. Just a short introduction to who I am. I'm a mystic in some ways. I teach spirituality in any case, and I also work in healing. I teach healing here in my room here in Andex in southern Germany, and also in Denmark and some other places where I've been invited to teach. This year has been a very important year for me because a lot of us, including myself, are aware that there are patterns that we're carrying which up until now we have not been aware of. They're seated deep in the subconsciousness. They can be quite old, and it's really a time for us to look at them and decide whether we want to continue to nourish them or if we want to let go of them. And I had an interesting thing happen to me just after Easter this year, 2017. I was driving down to Italy to look after our house, the garden. And it's a long drive from here to Italy, so I always put some talks on my iPhone to listen to in the car. When I was with Daskalos for the last 6-7 years of his life, I got interested in the Enneagram. Some of you might know about the Enneagram. It's about 9 personality types. It's a question of where it comes from, whether it comes from the Sufis. It doesn't matter. But the advantage of the Enneagram is it shows you your strengths along with your weaknesses. And one of the early authors on the Enneagram was a woman named Helen Palmer. Some of you might know her. She wrote some of the first books about the Enneagram 30 years ago. And I found a free talk of hers on YouTube or wherever, and I downloaded it. And I was just having a drive down to Italy, listening to the talk, and she was giving an introduction about her life and how she came upon the Enneagram. And then she stopped and she said, "I want to share something with you," to the interviewer. She said, about 20 years ago, a book came out on a topic, and that's what this talk is going to be about. And she said that changed her life when she became aware of this. And she realized that in spirituality and in mysticism, maybe even more so, there's a lot of things that we experience that we're not quite aware of. Some people, maybe the best way to describe it is say you're blind to it. And it's this idea which is called spiritual bypassing. And I was of the belief myself that my spirituality was actually very free, and had nothing to do with any damage or any fear. It was just free, and my time with Daskalos, one of the greatest mystics of the last few centuries, was just a gift, and everything that he taught me, I was able to build up over the last 22 years, my own work along with my wife. But when she went on to describe spiritual bypassing, she described it very succinctly and very to the point. And a lot of us, as I said earlier, a lot of us are facing patterns, especially in the last year, because it's a time to become aware. And this was like being hit with a pattern that I had no idea that I carried. And I want to just explain it to you very shortly. In spirituality, in the East and the West, we talk about that incarnated soul makes a home in a body, makes a personality in the body. And in particular, we talk about 7 energy centers or chakras: the root chakra, the sacral chakra, I call it the Hara chakra, the solar plexus, the heart chakra, throat chakra, third eye, and crown chakra. And when we find a family to incarnate into, we find a woman, typically together with a man who have decided, or it happened that they're going to become a child, and that would be us. And when we spend 9 months in the womb of the mother, we're already taking in the world. It's very clear now. And then when we're born 9 months later, it's very seldom that we're born into a couple who are quite free and quite awake. Typically, especially with our parents' generations, and our generation as well, we carry a lot of childhood stuff with us. And when we form a family and we come together with a partner and maybe have children, a lot of the stuff that we experienced in childhood, we just weren't able to digest, and we actually bring it into adulthood and then bring it into our family structures. That's to say that most families are relatively dysfunctional in some sense, because the mother and father have not looked at consciousness, and they have not had a chance to study what happened to them, and then to free themselves of some of the more subconscious or shadow sides of their personality. And so when we're born into a family, typically the mother and father are at some level or the other. They're using each other as mirrors, and then they're going to use us as mirrors. And there's going to be a certain amount of manipulation or even violence, not necessarily physical violence, but maybe emotional violence, or maybe mental violence, or even spiritual violence is going to occur. And when we incarnate, we spend about the first year, horizontal. We're basically lying down or being carried, maybe eventually crawling. But that means that our consciousness is rooted very much in the root chakra, because the root chakra is very existential. In the best of worlds, it's going to get a lot of love, a lot of care, a lot of comfort. But if the family's not functioning well, then it's not going to necessarily receive that. Now, what happens when you spend the first year in your root chakra, and your mother and father are not high-functioning people, and maybe your grandparents are around and they're not high-functioning, whatever that means, or your siblings, if they're already existing and older, are not very high functioning, is that what's going to go into the root chakra then is going to be a certain amount of fear or shame or guilt, a certain amount of damage, okay? And then at around a year old, most of us start to stand up and try to walk. When we do that, there's a movement in the chakra system up into what's called the Hara chakra or sacral chakra. And there we're going to be then much more involved in the world, because once we're mobile, we're going to be more active. And when we're more active, then we're going to lose part of our innocence. And over the 5 sense organs, we're going to start taking in much more of the world. And again, if the family continues, it remains to be rather subconscious, then you can even say that, to a certain extent, a second injury takes place in the personality, and that would be at the level of the Hara center or the sacral chakra. All right. Now, say that happened to you. that you chose a rather dysfunctional family, and you experienced one injury after the other. Now we get into the subject of what I mean to talk about here, because that's what I went through, and I'm not trying to present myself as a victim. I know why I did it, but I went through, I incarnated into a rather dysfunctional family, and who decided to have a lot of children, one after the other, and some of the children didn't even make it through childhood. And when in the lower chakras, in the root chakra and the Hara center, Hara chakra, and then the solar plexus after a while, if you see that you're in a situation as a child where there's not a lot of joy and not a lot of love and not a lot of trust and encouragement, then it could be that you might then plant a seed inside of your deeper levels of your subconscious. Here, let's say, a seed. And the seed will at some point break the earth and will then start to grow. And let's call that seed spiritual bypassing. Let's just call it spiritual bypassing. And here's the idea. The idea is when the lower chakras are injured and not a nice home, then we want to, at some point when we're capable, we want to be able to understand and explain the world. We want to be able to understand why that happened to us and maybe explain why that happened to us. And when this seed grows, it's going to bring us later into life, maybe when we're 15, maybe when we're 20, maybe when we're 20, in our early 20s, later 20s, we might go off to Nepal like I did, might end up by Daskalas like I did. And what we're looking for is we're looking for spirituality, we're looking for wisdom that will help explain to us the world, why it's like this, through the teachings of karma, the teachings of rebirth, the teachings of suffering, the teachings of, and so forth. And then when we receive these teachings and we start integrating them into our personality and into through the third eye mostly, what happens is we start to develop a worldview, which is built on spirituality. And we go deeply, we make a movement, and here's the bypassing. We make a movement, excuse me. We make a movement from the lower chakras up into the third eye. The third eye is the one chakra which is hungry for spirituality. Because the third eye wants to understand why everything is the way it is. And the third eye starts going into a type of gluttony where it wants to read this tradition in India, the Bhagavad Gita, the Dhammapadas, the Upanishads and so forth, maybe Confucius and so forth. And then it wants to read a lot of things that are rooted in Christianity, Meister Eckhart and Daskalos and Rudolf Steiner and others, and we start to get more and more wisdom, and it all goes over the third eye, especially in connection with the left hemisphere of the brain. And then we start to develop a lot of security, we think, because we can explain everything. You know, we can explain why this is like this. We can explain why the world's going in this direction. We can explain why we have a president like Trump in the States. We can explain this and that. We can explain why suddenly we have people like Edmund Snowden, who's a champion of transparency, and how all of this is working together. And it's all good. It's all good. It's all right, and it's all good. But what each one of us can do, it doesn't matter how old you are, but if you've made a home in spirituality like I have, you can sit down and you can say, did I use spiritual bypassing as a survival mechanism In other words, did I experience so much pain as a child that instead of experiencing the pain, I'm going to go into spirituality, go to Nepal, go to India, go to Daskalos, and receive spiritual teachings and wisdom which will help me look at that pain and explain it. And here's the point actually. And this is why I'm giving this short talk. If we, because of a very difficult and heavy childhood, use spiritual bypassing as a survival mechanism, and then later our whole adult life is formed by spirituality, can it be that the whole motivation for my spirituality or your spirituality is based on a path of escaping something? Can it be even more that your spirituality is basically based on an injury? Or could it even be that part of your spirituality is based on fear? Now this is very hard to look at because, like I said at the beginning of the talk, a lot of us, we develop security, and we develop safety, and we develop peace when we study the Gospel of John, when we study the Gospel of Thomas, when we read the Bhagavad Gita and so forth, the Quran and the Old Testament. But could it be that we're doing that we're doing that in a sort of type of panic? That we need to constantly go into spirituality and deeper into spirituality because we need to understand what happened to us. And now here's the point. If I go into the third eye and go into mysticism and go into healing and go into teaching, what happens with this core injury? What happens with the core injury here? I think the mail's coming. Yeah, I have to go. I'll be right back. 1 second. I'll be right there. Servus. Der ist gerade auf Klo.
Der ist gerade nicht da?
Ja, nein, der ist da. Der ist auf Toilette, aber kann nicht schreiben. Ja.
Gut, das ist für beide.
Okay, gut. Okay, danke.
Und das ist für ihn.
Okay, super. Schöne Sommer haben wir hier, oder?
Schon. Jetzt habe ich den Strichcode wieder gelöscht.
Okay. Sie geben auch nicht auf, kurze Hose.
Ja, wenn die lange Hose nass wird, dann klebt die so.
Ach so.
Als kurze Hose
okay,
besser.
Danke. Einen schönen Tag noch. Okay, danke.
Ja,
Wiederschauen. So. Yeah, this war einfach der Postträger. That was the postman. Yeah, sorry for the interruption. Could it be that when we find refuge and safety in spirituality, and we go deeply into, like I said, Daskalos' work or Steiner's work and other traditions, that we're doing that to constantly find safety, and doing that to not look at something that's deeply injured in us? Because it's the theory here is that this injury which occurred in early childhood does not go away through spirituality. It remains within us. And there's even a greater danger, is because when through the wisdom of spirituality, we can explain that. We can explain why we incarnated into a dysfunctional family. We can explain why we went through so much pain, subconsciously or consciously. And then when we do that from the safety of spirituality, we don't go into the pain. In fact, we're protected from the pain, but the pain is there. Okay, and that would mean, according to this theory of spiritual bypassing, which I find brilliant and so important right now, is that if we remain in spirituality, that injury will not be healed through spirituality. It won't. It can't be. Because the injury is much more honest and much more authentic. And when we constantly, through spirituality, can close that part of us off, because we can explain it away, then there's going to be a part of us which is then blind to something within us. Okay? Now, I've talked to a number of people in the last few months about spiritual bypassing. Some of them find it very helpful. Some of them find it not very helpful. I understand it 100%. Some of them didn't do it probably, and some of them may have done it and they don't want to look at it yet because they're so at home in spirituality. And I apologize to anybody who I might have offended in the last few months, because I tried to share this as much as possible in my courses, and also, but none of us want to be blind to a part of us. None of us. I mean, that we don't want to be blind. And if there's a part of us which we can't face, then maybe this is the time where we can say, yeah, maybe I did that. And it was good that I did that, because then I survived a very difficult childhood. It's good that I decided to go into spirituality, even when I was 2 or 3 years old, because spirituality means everything to me. It was a survival mechanism which I can be grateful for. But I want to now look at the injury, and I want to now embrace the injury, that I'm going to be one and not just divided in myself. Okay? My father, who was a philosopher and an expert on Kant, it's clear to me, my father did philosophical bypassing. Instead of going into his dysfunctional family in Brooklyn in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, he decided he would go deeply into Kant and into Nietzsche and to other philosophers as a way of explaining the world and not going into his pain. Other people do it through psychotherapy. They go into psychotherapy so deeply. I did it on the first impulse. I did it through sociology. My path was sociology, because I wanted to understand the society, that I could understand what happened to me. And then through, I could just say it was a societal problem and not a personal problem. You know, and then I ended up going to Kathmandu and studying with Rinpoches, and ended up being with Daskalos for the last 6-7 years of his life, which I'm remained eternally blessed for having that experience. So, I just tried to put this into a nutshell. Spiritual bypassing is based on the idea that a lot of us incarnated into a dysfunctional family. And in that dysfunctional family, we might have gone through one injury after the other. And these injuries are mostly in the lower chakras. And instead of looking at the injury or working on the injury, we go into a path of wisdom, a path of spirituality, a path of mysticism, where we can understand all the pain in the world, even our personal pain, but we don't experience it. And I know that I did spiritual bypassing. I did it completely, and I'm glad I did it. And I'm still very, very much at home in spirituality and in mysticism and healing, maybe even more so than before. But I don't want to be blind to a part of me which is still suffering, okay? And one of the nice things about being aware of spiritual bypassing and your own personal spiritual bypassing is then a door is opened that's going to be healed, because you're not going to be blind to it anymore. Okay, so folks, anyhow, I got this. This talk has been percolating in me for the last 2 or 3 months, and I have been rather undiplomatic in the circles that I work with and work in, by pointing out to a lot of my students and my friends that they might have done spiritual bypassing, and what a great thing it would be if they could look at it now and maybe even become aware of it. And for some people that was an eye-opener, a complete eye-opener, and they could see it immediately that they did it, and they had peace with it, but they don't want to be blind to it anymore. And with other people, clearly it didn't resonate with them, and that's fine. So again, for people that I've maybe offended with my enthusiasm for my new discovery, accept my apologies. And for other people, if you did this, then thank God you did it. If you did this, and your spirituality is partly based on a path of escaping something that happened to you, or your spirituality is based on an injury or fear, then embrace that and integrate that and heal. Okay. All right. Good. I'll put this on YouTube or Vimeo as soon as I can. All good blessings to you folks.